reform it.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 10:30 p.m. this evening, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 1892 with a further amendment. Further, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back, and the Senate vote on the motion to concur.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object, I think it's very important that the American people know that why we're here this evening. And why we're here is because Washington's completely broken. We are spending money like it's out of control, and this bill will have $1 trillion deficit, as bad or worse than any of President Obama's. And so what I ask my Republican colleagues is, why are we doing this when we condemned it on the other side? I object.
Is there objection?
I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 11 p.m. this evening, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 1892 with a further amendment. Further, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate vote on the motion to concur.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object. I think it's interesting how much energy we're spending when we could have had a 15-minute vote on this.
Regular order has been
called for. And yet nobody
for.
wants to vote on any of this. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 11:30 p.m. this evening, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 1892 with a further amendment. Further, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate vote on the motion to concur.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object seems like a lot of work for $1 trillion deficit, doesn't it?
Regular order is called for. Is there
Object.
objection?
Mr.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 12 p.m. this evening, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 1892 with a further amendment. Further, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate vote on the motion to concur.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object. $1 trillion Republican deficit. $1 trillion Republican deficit. The hypocrisy is astounding. Every one of these Republicans complained about President Obama's deficits, and yet now we have them out there bragging and pushing and doing everything they can to get their $1 trillion deficit through. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 12:30 a.m., the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 1892 with a further amendment. Further, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate vote on the motion to concur.
Is there objection?
President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object. Realize this charade is about Republicans wanting $1 trillion deficit.
Ask for regular order.
Regular order is called
object.
for. Is there objection?
I
Objection
object.
is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 1 a.m., the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to concur in the House amendment to Senate amendment to H.R. 1892 with a further amendment. Further, that if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate vote on the motion to concur.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object. We're talking about $1 trillion deficit.
Regular order.
We really
Mr.
ought to have a
Regular
little more
order is
discussion
called
about
for.
$1
Is there
trillion
objection?
deficit. I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I have asked unanimous consent that the Senate be allowed to vote on the pending matter. And there's been multiple objections, of course, by the senator from Kentucky. I don't know why we are basically burning time here while the senator from Kentucky and others are sitting in the cloakroom wasting everybody's time and inconveniencing the staff. We could easily move this matter forward and have a vote. The outcome will be exactly the same, and it's not inconsequential that The current continuing resolution, I believe, expires at midnight tonight. So, the senator from Kentucky, by objecting to the unanimous consent request, will effectively shut down the federal government for no real reason. I know he wants to make a point. He has that right. I agree with many of his concerns about deficits and debt, but we are in an emergency situation. We have our military that's not ready to fight and win our nation's wars the way it should be. We have military members who have died in accidents as a result of the lack of training and being stretched too thin because of budget cuts, and we need to fix that. General Mattis has pointed out that more American military members have died in training accidents and in regular operations than they have in combat. That's a tragedy that I would hope that all of us would want to address. And then, of course, there is the disaster relief that helps people who were victimized by Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, the wildfires out west, Hurricane Irma, and that's an emergency matter as well. So I don't understand why the senator from Kentucky wants to insist on shutting down the federal government when, after the time expires, under the regular order, the outcome will be exactly the same. I recognize he has that right, and he's objected to all of my unanimous consent requests to move the vote up earlier, but it makes no sense to me. It will not accomplish anything, and I just ask him to reconsider what he is doing in shutting down the entire federal government when the outcome to this vote will not be any different after the regular time expires than it would be if we had that vote starting at 10:30 tonight.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I think it is interesting, the debate we're having, and an important debate. And it is important to call attention to how we spend money in Washington and how the system is irrevocably broken. And we can cast blame where we want to cast blame, but I think for the record it's important to know that I've been offering all day to vote. I would like nothing more than to vote, but it's the other side. It's the leadership that has refused to allow any amendments. So we have what's called a closed debate. There will be no amendments. There will be no questioning of the authority, and the deal was made in secret, and the deal will not be debated on the floor, and there will be no amendments. So what I'm advocating for is, one, that we should reform the process. I don't advocate for shutting the government down, but neither do I advocate for keeping it open and borrowing $1 million a minute. In fact, the statistics this year are now closer to $2 million a minute. This is a government that is horribly broken. This is a system that is horribly broken, and senator after senator will come up quietly and they will say, oh, this is the last time I'm voting for a continuing resolution. This is terrible. This is a terrible way to run the government. This is a rotten way to run the government, and yet they keep voting for it. They're in charge. Why have we been doing this for 40 years? 4 times in 40 years have we actually done our job, where we voted on each individual appropriation bill. Earlier today, I went through some of the waste. It's amazing the waste that's going on. William Proxmire was first pointing out this waste in 1968. One of the examples he pointed to was that money was being spent studying why men fall in love with women. Now, you may be curious as to that, and if you are, ask your friends to get a crowdsourcing, and you can go study why men fall in love with women, but that's not a function of government. But that waste goes on decade after decade after decade, and nothing is ever fixed. So what we have is a 700-page bill that will not have been read by anything. I was just reading some of the things that are stuck in there that nobody have any idea how they got in there. 700 pages, all of the spending glommed together in one bill with no oversight. This is a terrible, rotten, no good way to run your government, and it's been going on decade after decade, and everyone admits it's a terrible, rotten, no good way to run your government, and yet nobody stands up and says enough's enough. They say it's a binary choice, young man, take it or leave it. Well, I'll leave it. I don't want to shut down government, but somebody ought to insist that we have an open amendment process. Someone should insist that we root out waste in government. We've had a partial audit of the Pentagon, and we found out that $800 million was misplaced or lost. What's been done so far on the audit showed over $100 billion has been wasted in the Pentagon. And so what do? We reward them with more money. We've been trying to get a complete audit of this Pentagon for 17 years, and you know what they argue? They say, well, we're too big to be audited. How galling is that? When your government tells you that we are too big to be audited. This goes on decade after decade after decade. Everybody in Washington complains about it. All the constituents complain about it. All of America complains about it, and yet we do it time after time. And then people say, well, look, this is a bipartisan deal. Kumbaya. Republicans and Democrats are holding hands to spend more money. Well, it's the opposite of what you want. You want compromise in Washington, but we should be compromising to spend less money, not more. Every one of the Republicans, count them, you can look it up on the internet, every one of the Republicans said that Barack Obama, President Obama, was a spendthrift and he had trillion-dollar deficits, and we railed day in, day out, year in, year out against it. Rightfully so. It was too much debt and too much spending. We were against that. That's what I ran for office on. But I'm not about to turn my head the other way and say, oh, it's fine because my party's doing it. That's what this is about. It's pure, empty partisan politics where people are saying, oh, it's okay for Republicans to have debts, but it was bad for Democrats to have debts. Now it's time we stood up and said it's a rotten system and it should end. How will it end? It's never going to end by people always passing the buck and saying, oh, I'm voting, this is my last continuing resolution. I hate continuing resolutions. They're terrible. This is my last one, but I'm going to vote for one more. And maybe next year, or actually in a month, because we'll be doing this again in a month. You realize we're on our fourth continuing resolution. This has nothing to do with the budget, and the media kind of confuses us. They say we have a budget deal. No, we have a continuing resolution deal. This is not a budget. This isn't some sort of plan. This hasn't gone through a committee. There's no appropriation bills that are going through committee. There's no oversight happening to your government. And so when I tell you that $356,000 was spent last year studying why what happens to Japanese quail when they're on cocaine, are they more sexually promiscuous on cocaine? This is what your government's spending money on, but it doesn't get any better because we never root out the waste. In fact, the agency that's been doing this research ends up getting more every year. They're like, oh, we like science. Well, if you like science, you'll like this one. They took $700,000 from autism research and they spent it studying what Neil Armstrong said when he was on the moon. Did he say one small step for man, or did he say one small step for a man? We spent $700,000 studying whether the preposition a was in Neil Armstrong's statement. $700,000 that should have been spent on autism. So this isn't really just about fiscal conservatism, although it is. It's also about how best to spend money for legitimate expenses. Every time you spend money in a wasted way, you're taking it away from something that presumably was less wasteful. So this is a big deal. Do I want to shut down government? No. But do I want to keep it open and not reform it? Hell no. That's what's going on. $1 trillion deficit this year. It's going to be bigger probably. But we were approaching $1 trillion before they added $300 billion new spending to this. So this is a problem. This is a big deal. And what I've said all day long, I'll vote all day long. Start the process, open the doors. We could have had 40 amendments today. We've been at this all day with the other side blocking amendments, trying to have no debate, and trying to close the door so a secret deal, a deal done in secret, can be forced on everyone else. So yes, we should have debate. Yes, we should have a vote. Let's have a vote tonight on amendments. Let's have amendments. Let's determine whether the American people or the Senate are really in favor of busting the caps. I have one amendment. I'm not asking for a dozen amendments. I'm not asking for 100 amendments. I'm not asking for 1,000 amendments. I'm asking for one. Takes 15 minutes. So realize these people all day that want to paint a picture, one, they're embarrassed, and I understand that. They are embarrassed by this situation because they know the hypocrisy is thicker than pea soup. They know the hypocrisy is out there. They know they railed and they railed and they railed against President Obama's debt. $1 trillion deficits. Every one of them railed against it, and now they're going to have to vote tonight for a $1 trillion deficit. So that is the problem here. And so there is a certain embarrassment to bring this up. And so the embarrassment causes them to say, we don't want any amendments. We're not going to have any amendments because we don't want to discuss this. It really ought to be discussed. And so much more should be discussed. It isn't just that we're blocking amendments or debate on spending, or that we're not doing our job on appropriations bills. We're also not doing our constitutional duty on the declaration of war. You know, this was something that the Founding Fathers were explicit on. The power to declare war was given to Congress. Section 1, Article 1, Section 8, given to Congress. In fact, there's discussion of this. There was extensive discussion of this. Almost every Founding Father weighed in on the fact that war should be declared by the legislature. Madison put it this way. He said that the executive branch is most prone to war. Therefore, with studied care, that power was vested in the legislature. When's the last time we declared war? Well, officially, we haven't declared war since World War II, but we sort of voted, at least we came to Congress, at least George Bush came to Congress when we went to Afghanistan the first time and we went to Iraq the first time. And there were votes. But these votes were long ago, nearly a generation ago, and they really don't apply to anything we're doing now. And there's a certain intellectual dishonesty to those who continue to say that the vote to go into Afghanistan has anything to do with what we're doing over there now. There is no military solution there, and that also ties into our budgetary problems. We do not have enough money to build nations around the world and think that we can build our nation here at home. So when people talk about nation building, I say, yeah, you're right, but we need to do some nation building here. The president has talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, but there's no money for it. So look, we're borrowing $1 trillion before we get started on people advocating for a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. There is no money. And so if we want to find the money, we have to make difficult choices. As people come to my office and they say, we want money for X, we want money for Y, we want money for Z, I listen carefully, I listen sympathetically, and I try to say, look, we're a rich country. We ought to be able to do what you're asking me, and yet we have a $1 trillion deficit. That everything has to be reflected by the fact that we are out of money and horribly spending a great excess of what comes in. But nobody's making these difficult choices because we just keep adding on to the tab. We basically just borrow more money. So when President Obama was president, you know, we were, under George W. Bush, we went sort of $5 trillion to $10 trillion for the total debt. Under President Obama, we went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. We're on sort of that same curve again. In fact, we may be escalating that curve as we speak. But that enormous debt, we all criticized as Republicans and said it was a bad thing for your government. And there was a debt commission, and there was all of this discussion and a lot of hand-wringing. And I was one of those. I was concerned, but still am concerned. So we have this debt that continues to escalate, and yet what do Republicans do when they are in charge? You remember the stories. If you were asked to help Republicans, they said, well, we took over the House, but now we control 1/2 of 1/3 of government. We can't get everything we want. So it didn't happen. And then we took over the Senate, and we controlled 1/3 of government. They said, well, we have to have the presidency. And then, lo and behold, we won the presidency. We have all the branches of government, and yet we still are putting forward a spending bill that will be the equivalent of a $1 trillion deficit. Is it wrong to point that out? Is it wrong to want better of your own party? Is it wrong to think that we ought to do our job, that we ought to go into an appropriation process? The House actually did it. People say, oh, we can't do that anymore. The House of Representatives passed all 12 appropriation bills. It can be done. And it's actually maybe not the panacea I would hope, in the sense that there's still too much money being spent even through the appropriation process. So it really needs to go hand in hand with two things. We should do the appropriation bills. 12 departments of government, let's pass them one at a time. But we should also keep in mind as we're spending money or voting to spend money that the Constitution limits very much what the Congress can do. There are enumerated powers given to Congress under Article 1, Section 8. That's what we're supposed to do. And this was a big deal to the Founding Fathers. In fact, they were very specific that those rights not listed were not to be disparaged. So the listing of the Bill of Rights is a partial listing of your rights. But they were also very careful to say that the powers that were granted to the federal government were a complete list, and anything not listed in the powers granted was to be retained by the people in the states, by states and the people respectively. And that's part of our problem, is we decided we wanted a government that was everything to everyone. And you ask yourself, is one party better than the other? Maybe at times, but really, if you're looking for responsibility, they want to cast blame. All of a sudden, I, myself, somehow am responsible for the whole problem up here. Well, actually, I've made them angry, and they're very upset with me because I've, made it difficult, and we're going to have to be up late tonight. And they're angry that I'm pointing out their hypocrisy. And that is a big problem, and nobody likes to have that pointed out. But if we don't, if we just continue on this course, I think there's a great danger to the nation. I think there is a day of reckoning coming, and I think that our debt eventually could get the better of us, that it could really threaten the underpinnings, the undergirdings of our country, and it could do it in a couple different ways. For some time now, we have manipulated interest rates through the Federal Reserve. We've kept them below market rate. This led to a huge housing bubble and a housing correction. We don't really have the housing bubble happening, but many of you may have noticed there's been a huge stock market bubble. And there is a question whether that has been fed, and the fury of that has been fed by Fed policy, and whether or not the desire to keep interest rates low to make it cheap to borrow money, whether or not that someday will have a boom that leads to a bust. And I really think that is a worry. The stock market's been very jittery in the last few days, and I think some of that has to do, and it's funny how people interpret it. Some on the left will say, oh, the stock market is jittery because the government might shut down for 2 hours. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. But it could be perhaps that they are jittery because we are a government that is profligate in our spending and is perpetually spending more that comes in, and have such a great imbalance that, maybe a third of what we're doing up here is financed. And they say, well, it'd be one thing to actually finance, a house or something like that, but if you're financing your rent or if you're financing your groceries each month, there's a problem. We're having trouble paying our day-to-day expenses because we're borrowing them. Much has been said that the military needs the money, and I believe in a strong national defense. In fact, I believe that our national defense is actually the most important thing that the federal government does. It's one of those things that the state government can't do. And so, yes, I want a strong national defense. But you have to ask yourself whether a $20 trillion debt makes us a stronger country or a weaker country. I think it was Admiral Milliken who said that the #1 threat currently to our country is our national debt. There is this question of whether or not an insolvent nation can be a strong nation. So as we look through this, I think it'd be wise that we would look at this spending bill and say, this is not the way we should run our government. And we as Republicans, if we really truly are conservative, we should be putting forward something that's looking towards balance at the very least, instead of going in the opposite way. So I would ask the Senate to really take a look at themselves, look in the mirror and say, is this really what we stand for? Is this what we've been running for all these years, to control government and then be no different than our counterparts across the aisle? So today, I think, is a day of reflection, but hopefully a day in which there will be some who will say, enough's enough, I'm not going to do it anymore.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, we find ourselves in another position like we found ourselves in before. We find ourselves in a position in which the government spending authority is set to expire in just a few hours. We've known this was coming for weeks, just like we did with the last continuing resolution, and the one before that, and the one before that. As Undersea World Jacques Cousteau once observed, we're living in an interminable succession of absurdities imposed by the myopic logic of short-term thinking. every time we approach this as if it were somehow going to be different this time. We quibble from time to time about this or that policy. We quibble from time to time about the price tag. Sometimes we're so focused on the policy and the price tag that we forget about the process. And it's primarily to this subject, the process, that I'd like to turn my attention for the next few minutes. You see, the process is important around here. We come from different backgrounds. We come from different states representing diverse interests across this great country. We're not going to agree on everything. In fact, there are a lot of things on which we strongly disagree. And that's why we have processes. The Constitution is itself all about the process. In fact, the Constitution is more or less agnostic as to the substantive policy outcome. It's all about connecting the American people to their government that's there to serve them. It's all about making sure that there is responsiveness and accountability from the government to the people, to make sure that the government serves the people and not the other way around. And so it's for this reason, it's very important that each member who holds an election certificate in this body, or in the body just down the hall from us in the House of Representatives, is allowed to express his or her opinions and have them matter. Nowhere is this more important, Mr. President, than when it comes to spending bills. You see, it's spending bills where we have the opportunity to exercise oversight over the federal government, a government that requires the American people to spend many months out of every year working just to pay their tax bills, a federal government that imposes $2 trillion every single year in regulatory compliance costs on the American people, a government that has the power to destroy a business or a livelihood, or in some cases, lives. It's important that we exercise this oversight, and without spending constraints, there can be no meaningful oversight. Without an adequate process, the Republican form of government cannot fulfill its role. The American people are no longer in charge of their government when this happens. For this reason, it's a little disturbing that a government that spends nearly $4 trillion every single year makes its spending decisions in one fell swoop, as it does. You see, whenever we pass a continuing resolution, what we're doing effectively as a Congress is pressing a reset button that keeps current spending levels intact, in place, unchanged, as if there were no reviewing body, as if there had been no elections, as if the American people didn't matter at all to the process by which they're governed. This is an abdication of our role as the people's elected representatives. This disconnects the American people. And we wonder, Mr. President, why it is that this is an institution, Congress, that enjoys an approval rating somewhere between 9 and 14%, making us slightly less popular than Fidel and Raul Castro in America, and only slightly more popular than the influenza virus, which is rapidly gaining on us. It is for this reason, because we've disconnected the American people from their own government. And one of the ways in which we do that is when we pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funded at current levels without any additional changes. And when these things are offered, often within just hours of the expiration of a spending deadline. So we've got a bill before us. It's quite lengthy, that we've had access to for only about 24 hours, a little bit less than that. And we're asked to make a binary choice as to that legislation, yes or no. Vote for it, and in this case, there are some things that you get. You get $90 billion in emergency spending. You get an increase of spending caps of about $300 billion over 2 years. You get in excess of $1 trillion in new debt. Some have estimated it could be more like $1.5 trillion, but we'll be talking about a $22 trillion debt by the second quarter of 2019 as a result of this bill. And we are told when we receive this bill, you've got two options. You can vote yes and accept all of those things, or you can vote no. And there's no opportunity for anything in between there. No opportunity to amend it, no opportunity to improve it. And if you think about it, Mr. President, there's not really a meaningful opportunity for debate if you don't have a meaningful opportunity to amend a legislative provision once it's introduced. And so members are told over and over and over again, you've either got to vote for this and accept the government as is with no changes, or with changes that you might find incredibly disturbing, or you'll be blamed for a shutdown. Why is this okay? Now, one of the things that we hear from the American people, quite understandably, quite justifiably, is why can't you just all get into a room and come to an agreement? Well, this is that room. There are two such rooms here in the Capitol. One is in the Senate, one is in the House of Representatives. This is the room where that's supposed to take place. There are mechanisms by which that's supposed to occur through the amendment process. People offer up legislation, they offer to improve legislation. If they have concerns with it, they can offer up amendments. When members are denied that opportunity, the American people are disconnected yet again from that process. Who benefits from this? Well, it certainly isn't the American people, who find that their government gets bigger and more expensive. It does so at their expense, at the American people's expense. And every time we undertake this process again, we pass another continuing resolution. We suggest that it's somehow okay to fund the government this way, with one decision affecting every aspect of government in one vote, put forward under sort of extortive circumstances in which members are told, you've either got to do this or the government's going to shut down, and you will be blamed for that if you vote against it. This isn't right. Why couldn't we bring legislation to the floor, not hours, but weeks or even months before the deadline? Why couldn't we allow that to occur, to allow the debate, the discussion to occur under the light of day, rather than having this legislation negotiated under cover of darkness, behind closed doors, where the American people are left out? I've thought about this on many occasions, and how there are very few circumstances in our day-to-day lives that are like the way Congress spends money. It's occurred to me that if you moved into a new area, a very remote area, and you had access to only one grocery store for many, many miles, for many, many hours, and you were on your way home from work, your spouse called you and said, stop at the store, pick up bread, milk, and eggs. And so you go to the store and you get your grocery cart, and you go to the bread aisle and you put a loaf of bread in your cart, and a carton of milk, and a dozen eggs. And you get to the checkout counter and you put out your bread and your milk and your eggs. And the cashier rings those things up and says, I'm sorry, you may not purchase bread, milk, and eggs unless you also purchase a half-ton of iron ore, and a bucket of nails, and a book about cowboy poetry, and a Barry Manilow album. In fact, this is a special kind of store where you have to buy all of those things. And in fact, you have to buy one of every item in this entire store in order to buy any of these things, including the bread, the milk, and the eggs. Well, that would start to approximate what it feels like to spend money in Congress, where we're told you can't fund any part of government unless you're willing to fund all of government, subject to such changes as the few people who write the continuing resolution might insert. And you, by the way, having been duly elected by the citizens of your state, will be left out of the process other than to exercise the binary choice of yes or no. And so, Mr. President, we've seen that this is how we get to be $20 trillion in debt, soon to be $22 trillion in debt. We don't get to be $20 trillion, soon to be $22 trillion in debt, without a whole lot of agreement on the part of a whole lot of people to do that. It's a bipartisan exercise, to be sure. Bipartisanship is necessary, but the fact that it's bipartisan doesn't always make it holy. You don't get to be $20 trillion in debt without a whole lot of Republicans agreeing with a whole lot of Democrats that we're going to do precisely that. It might inure to the benefit of a few people who stand to benefit every time the government gets bigger or more expensive, every time we do things this way, but it hurts everyone else. The process matters. The fact is, we will not always come to an agreement as to how much we ought to spend. We will not always come to an agreement as to those things on which we will be spending the requisite amount of money. But I think we should be able to agree that the American people deserve a process, one that allows them to be heard through the people's own elected representatives. If not us, who? If not now, when? At what point are we going to start appropriating funds through this government, through a process that's open, that's transparent, that can be observed by the American people, and through which the American people can be heard? At the end of the day, we must remember that we are great as a country, not because of who we are, but because of what we do. To the extent that we've recognized as a nation that the dignity of the human soul matters, that the rights of the individual have to be taken into account, and that the government works for the people, we have prospered and will prosper in the future. But we have to be willing to respect the American people, and we should not be surprised when we ignore them over and over again, when we shut them out of a process that directly and materially impacts their lives. We should not be shocked when they respond with horror. We shouldn't be surprised when wave election after wave election signals dissatisfaction with this very body, with this very entity that serves as the legislative branch of our federal government. So each time we're presented with one of these continuing resolutions, or with a one-size-fits-all spending package, where we're told you've got to either vote for it and all of it with no opportunity to improve it, or you've got to vote against it, I have concerns with that. I've got significant concerns with this particular legislation, and I will vote no. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I came in the hall just in the middle of a couple of these statements that have been made, and I was confused because I thought we were talking about the tax bill, the bill that went through the Senate in December with no hearings, no amendments. It didn't even have a fig leaf of bipartisanship. And I'm puzzled as to my two colleagues who seem so worried about the deficit, both of whom I believe voted for that bill, which according to the Congressional Budget Office is going to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit. So there are two issues. One is process and one is results. I myself am concerned about results. I'm concerned about the deficit, and I think it's a legitimate question, but it ill behooves one who less than 6 weeks ago voted for a massive unfunded tax cut that will increase our deficit by well over $1 trillion. So it's okay as a matter of deficit politics to be for that bill and against a bill that funds community health centers in my state, that funds opioid treatment, which is desperately needed across this country, that funds our military in a way that they can operate and actually meet the needs of the national security of this country. That's what the bill before us does. So we can argue about those things, but it's touching, frankly, to hear these very lugubrious comments about process, when the process on the tax bill was one of the worst processes in the history of this body. When tax reform was passed in 1986, there were some 33 hearings before the Finance Committee. It took 14 months, and the vote in the Senate was something like 90-10. That was a process. The process on the tax bill in December was atrocious. It was an embarrassment. The City Council in Bangor, Maine would not have amended the leash law using that process. And now tonight people are coming and complaining about process, the people who voted for that bill. I'm sorry, I'm not very persuaded by that. At least now, there has been some process in the sense that it's been bipartisan, that our leaders have been able to negotiate. There have been input from the Appropriations Committee, from members of the rank and file on both sides and in both houses. I admit it's not a great process, but it seems to me those who are raising that issue tonight forfeited the right to raise that issue when they voted for the tax bill, as far as I know, without a peep about process or about deficits. So, Mr. President, I agree. We ought to get back to regular order. We ought to get back to working together. We ought to get back to committee hearings. But let's not have this amnesia from 6 weeks ago when we made one of the most significant decisions, a once-in-a-generation decision about permanent tax policy that's going to affect the budget and the debt of this country for a whole generation. And here tonight, we're getting all of this strong emotional plea about process, about what amounts to a 2-year budget, which, by the way, is the way we should do it, not according to this process, but we ought to be talking about 2-year budgets. So, Mr. President, I'm sympathetic on both the deficit issue and the process issue. But the lawyer in me says you're stopped from raising that argument if you voted for the tax bill. You can't have it both ways. I listened to my esteemed colleague from Utah, and I understand his concerns. I share his concerns. If only he'd said that in December. But instead, he says it tonight when we're talking about funding our military, funding opioid treatment, funding children's health care. Mr. President, I think you got to work it both ways. You can't just take one side of the debate and say it's okay to do a tax cut with no process, but it's not okay to take a bipartisan negotiated arrangement on the budget because all of a sudden we're concerned about process. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
I appreciate the keen insights of my friend and distinguished colleague, the senator from Maine. I would point out here, there was process on the tax bill. It may not have been perfect. In fact, it wasn't. But there was a process. We had amendments. We were allowed to offer them, to have them considered. We did, in fact, take votes. There is no process on this. Now, I've been told by some members of this body, some from my party, some from the other party, that there is a process because members of the Appropriations Committee have had input on this. That isn't a process that belongs to the Senate. That's for one committee. It's not a substitute for floor consideration. There is a provision of the United States Constitution that makes certain kinds of amendments to the Constitution patently unconstitutional. That provision says that you can't do anything to alter the equal representation of the states within the United States Senate. Consistent with the spirit of that provision, we've got to make sure that we don't make changes to Senate procedure in a way that creates a superclass of senators. We don't want to get to a point to paraphrase George Orwell, where we say all senators are equal, but some are more equal than others. Process within the Appropriations Committee is not Senate process. We did, in fact, have a process on the tax bill. It was not perfect, but it was a process. Here, there isn't. Here, there's not an opportunity for amendments. There's not an opportunity for a single amendment. That is a material distinction, and it's one worth noting here. It's also worth noting here that we've done this over and over and over again. What is this, the 5th continuing resolution of this fiscal year alone? This is happening over and over and over again, so much so that many members of this body have never seen it operate any differently. That's a sad state of affairs, and one that ought to be troubling to members of both political parties and to members of this body from every part of this great country. Thank you, Mr. President.